Welcome to our Perspectives on Persian Art lecture series. This is the fourth in a wonderful, successful series that we've had, which parallels another 15-week lecture series that we completed with Amy Landau yesterday, organized by the Society of Asian Art. And today it's my pleasure to introduce and welcome a wonderful friend and colleague, Dr. Amy Landau, Associate Curator of Islamic and Indian Art at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. Amy has had a very long and varied research commitment to Persian art, and has with a particular interest in manuscript painting, but which also extends widely into other areas. And today the talk will bring together her long-standing interests in Armenian, European, and Persian art together in what promises to be a wonderful lecture. Before I turn it over to Amy, I would also greatly like to thank Tina Muqaddam and Hamid Muqaddam, who have been very, very generous and enthusiastic supporters of Persian art at the museum here, not only with our galleries and publications, but also making this lecture series possible. And I hope we plan to continue with our efforts on Persian art and culture, and stay tuned for more. So with that, Dr. Amy Landau, please welcome her.
I'm going to talk about interaction between Europe and Iran in the 17th century, so the early modern period, and how much of this interaction was mediated through a community of Armenians, who I'll speak about in a second. I'm just going to, okay. So, in Persian verse, the poet of 17th century Iran, Mirza Tahir Vahid, playfully wrote, "Scarlet cloth came straight to this country from Europe, and the robe maker pinned his faith on it as if it were a traveler's gift." Mirza Tahir Vahid speaks directly to the wealth one could attain with imported European luxury wares, specifically selling robes of brilliant red velvet to the affluent of Safavid Iran. Those with money attained an ever greater quantity and variety of European goods and luxury wares in 17th century Isfahan, affectionately described as half the world by its inhabitants. Isfahan was a thriving node in a trading network that linked cities across Europe, Asia, Africa, and even Latin America. The city served as the seat of Safavid power from the 16th century, from the late 16th century, and to the initial decades of the 18th century, when the Safavid dynasty came to an end with the Afghan invasions. Here we're looking at the Royal Maidan, also called Maidan-e-Naqsh Jahan, or the Maidan of the design or imprint of the world. People from all over the world flocked to the Royal Square to buy and to sell luxury wares and other goods. In the 17th century, one could hear various languages spoken in the Maidan: Persian, Turkish, Hindi, Russian, French, Italian, Chinese, English, you name it, you heard it in 17th century Isfahan. This glorious city was built up by Shah Abbas I, who we talked about yesterday. Shah Abbas reigned from 1587 to 1629, and he's the individual who moved the Safavid capital from Qazvin to Isfahan at the end of the 16th century. He constructed his city with palaces, gardens, markets, and glorious suburbs, which we're going to look at today. It became one of the most beautiful and talked about cities of the early modern world. Shah Abbas, we're looking at a European print of this man, was the fourth reigning Persian ruler of the Safavid dynasty. and here I'm just going to locate you in geography. The Safavid dynasty reigned from 1501 to 1722. The Safavids established Shi'i Islam as the state religion of Iran. This was a major factor, as it is today, in the emergence of a unified national consciousness among the various ethnic and linguistic elements of the country. Safavid Iran is designated in purple, dark purple on the map. It's sandwiched, if you will, between two other great early modern empires. We have the Mughal Empire in South Asia in beige, and also the Ottomans that bordered on northwest Iran, which is in that khaki color. Few commentators would fail to highlight Shah Abbas's diplomatic, economic, political, and military endeavors, nor would they neglect to discuss the privileges that Shah Abbas granted to Christian missionaries and the East India companies. During Shah Abbas's reign, the Augustinians, the Carmelites, the Capuchins were given license to reside and to build in the empire. Shah Abbas also gave license to the Dutch and the East India companies. It was under his successors, particularly Shah Abbas II, who we're going to meet in a little bit, where you have the French coming into the empire. The Jesuits were given license under his successor, Shah Abbas II, as was the French East India Company. Here we have a very different type of exchange. Centuries past, of course, Europeans came to Iran for trade, for diplomacy. Missions were sent to Iran and received. But this century has a particular character because you have Europeans residing within Iran. So you have social interaction that continued over decades. Relationships were formed, ideas were discussed and communicated. These ideas revolved around science, technology, the visual arts, poetry. We're looking at one of the most glorious suburbs of Isfahan, New Julfa, where many of the Christians resided. After the middle of the 17th century, the majority of Christians around Isfahan were living in New Julfa. So when I mention the name of certain travelers today, European travelers, they were residing in this suburb. It was established at the beginning of the 17th century also by Shah Abbas. And he created New Julfa to house a community of Armenian merchants that he forcibly deported from Julfa on the river Arax at the beginning of the 17th century. I don't have a pointer, do I? No. Okay. So the Armenian community that Shah Abbas forcibly deported was from Julfa on the river Arax. It laid between the Ottomans and the Safavids. Shah Abbas I decided to forcibly move this Armenian merchant community and place them outside his empire because they had very strong connections, mercantile connections that were already built up in the late 15th and 16th century. They already had an international trade network. So Shah Abbas moved them outside of Isfahan, and many of you saw this yesterday, Julfa is located right below the Zayande Rud, the life-giving river, very close to where the court was building up the court precinct. I don't have a pointer. It's okay. Okay. So you have the Chahar Bagh that leads from, you could look at the Maidan. Do you want to point? Sure. We're going to have a community day. Yeah. Do you want to show Julfa, right? Do you want to show the Chahar Bagh?
Here's the river.
Yeah. Exactly.
Here is Jaffa, the suburb.
Exactly. So fantastic. Do you want to give the lecture?
I do have a question.
Okay, good. Well, we have plenty of time for questions, so that's fantastic. So there were a number of bridges that were built up that linked the court precinct with the suburb of New Julfa. We're looking at one, the Ali Verde Khan Bridge, that was built by one of Shah Abbas's generals, who was actually an Armenian apostate. 3 other bridges during the 17th century were constructed to link the court with the suburb of Julfa. So these bridges linked basically the palaces that were built by the court with some of the fine mansions of the Armenian elite. Here we're looking at Petros Veligianian, a portrait that hangs in the church he built, which you could see visiting New Julfa today. He was the patriarch of one of the most affluent Armenian families of Julfa. New Julfa was a central node of a vast trading network that extended from Manila in the east to Amsterdam in the west. The Julfan trade network was a circuit consisting of a nodal center, which was New Julfa in Safavid Iran, that was constantly in communication with a number of satellite communities or dispersed nodes around it. They were connected with one another as well as to the nodal center in Isfahan. These satellite communities consisted of New Julfan merchants. So basically you had the wealthy families of New Julfa who had merchants working underneath them. They were being dispersed from the suburb of New Julfa, and this would form sort of communities that are internationally based and systems of trust between them. Here you'll see on the left side, you see the portrait in the Bethlehem Church, which is located in Metz Maidan, or the Great Maidan, the commercial heart of New Julfa. These merchants built up to 25 to 30 of these glorious churches throughout the 17th century. We discussed yesterday that they were using European prints, iconography to decorate their churches. And they were showing both their piety and their political influence by establishing these churches. These Armenians became very important purveyors of European art and European goods. They were trafficking clocks, London cloth, mirrors, and paintings. And this is amply documented in the primary source material from this period. This is the type of table clock that was popular in 17th century Iran. This dates from the late 16th century from Nuremberg, and we know from the sources that this is the type of clocks that they were circulating around. They were also bringing some very rare and interesting instruments to the Safavid court. One traveler who arrived in Isfahan in 1664 reports that an Armenian brought a spinet from the Netherlands that was played at an audience of one of Shah Abbas's successors, who I mentioned earlier, by the name of Shah Abbas II. He reigned from 1642 to 1666. Either through political negotiations or trade, these Armenian merchants tended to have significant contact with Europeans in their production, not only due to their trade network, but also due to their familiarity with European languages and the fact that there was this shared religious connection with the Christian communities of Europe. The role that the Armenians played is, for example, documented in a 17th century letter that is now housed in the Bodleian Library at the University of Oxford, which cites a certain Armenian merchant, Khoja Safar, which describes the negotiation of the payment of custom dues previously arranged between Shah Abbas I, who we saw earlier, and Charles I of England. Here's two beautiful paintings. We're looking at paintings that are nearly life-sized. The cosmopolitan milieu of 17th century Isfahan is represented in this group of oil paintings that date between the 1650s and around the turn of the century, around the 18th century, that depict nearly life-size standing figures. Rather than specific individuals, these are not portraits, they represent types that are defined by their headgear. They represent different linguistic and ethnic groups of Safavid Iran. We know that this one represents an Armenian woman by the headgear. The Armenians wore a particular headgear which covered the chin and a beautiful framing of the face with pearls. And we see how similar actually this oil painting is to the print by Cornelius de Bruyn, who was an early 18th century traveler to Iran. And de Bruyn was very focused on very accurately documenting the sites and the people of the empire. The primary aspect of these oil paintings is the description of wealth, refinement, and social hierarchy. The unmistakable sense of affluence that underscores the oil paintings is conveyed through their surroundings, much of which is defined by European material culture. The painting's basic structure was extracted from European royal portraiture, which was known to have circulated in both print and oil throughout the 17th century. For example, the columns decorated with putti and the balustrade, which we see here, plus the checkered board floor, are all coming from royal portraiture. And here are portraits of Louis XIII and Anne of Austria. And I think it's very easy to see the parallels between the Safavid oil paintings and these two French examples. French portraiture circulated in Iran. We know that in 1629, the Capuchin mission, the Capuchins I mentioned earlier, presented the Shah Abbas I at this time, with portraits of Louis XIII and Anne of Austria. So we know that these portraits existed in the royal treasury. And this is kind of a fun comparison, which was partially humor, but I mean, it's an obvious comparison. Here we see the self-portrait of Anthony van Dyck, who, of course, was the court painter of the English king, Charles I, and another one of these surviving large oil paintings from Safavid Iran. We see that the very stately column serves as the main backdrop to these quote-unquote portraits. Yesterday, we saw the significance of images of Henrietta Maria that court painters of the Persian Shah was copying. They were given portraits of Henrietta Maria, Charles I, and their offspring were presented to the court in 1637-38. According to one eyewitness report, Shah Safi studied these portraits. His engagement with these oil paintings is described by the English agent Thomas Parry on April 16, 1638, and I quote, "The king viewed the pictures with a serious eye, as if he were much taken with them, and after dinner we were told that he was viewing them in a private room. He viewed them for a long time, and the next day the king's official sent to know the names of the queen and the children, and also to have the letters translated out of English into Persian." Clearly, Safavid patrons identified with the formal visual language of European royal portraiture that indicated the wealth and position of a particular sitter, and had extracted it to represent the hierarchy and the formality of their own milieu. The presence of imported luxury items in these oil paintings projected cosmopolitanism and wealth. The carefully depicted wine decanter on the table and the very delicate long-stem glass held by the Armenian woman have been identified as Venetian manufacture. And actually the decanter I don't know if you could see it, but there's a three-headed eagle on top of the decanter, which has been identified as Russian manufacture. She's also indicating her wealth through the scarlet velvet of the robe that was an Italian import mentioned by the Safavid poet earlier on, as well as her jewelry. So while the costume anchors her firmly in Safavid Iran, the material background is a bit of fantasy, as we saw. They're not reflective of Safavid furnishings, but rather their understanding and their engagement with European portraiture. And the urn that you're seeing in the foreground is basically copied from a printed book that was used by European artists to create fantastic, incredible objects that actually didn't exist, but were being reproduced in visual culture, but were not material. The gold baroque table clocks and the pocket watches placed on the table are yet a further reference to European craftsmanship. The depicted luxury goods in the late Safavid oil represent the reality of the wealthy Safavid consumer. If one had the money, an ever greater quantity and variety of foreign goods and luxury wares could be obtained. The economic and political elite procured hardware, such as mirrors and stained glass, London cloth, handbags, and fake pearls, and luxury items such as fine tableware, enameled objects, and gold clocks from Europe. They were acquired via agents, personal agents, and also sold in the bazaars of the empire's urban markets, both in Isfahan and in New Jolfa, for example. Here you're looking at oil paintings. Well, actually you're looking at wall paintings. The one on the lower left-hand side are wall paintings that exist in one of the few extant houses of New Jolfa that would have been owned by an Armenian merchant. Unfortunately, many of these have been, they no longer exist. There are only probably 4 or 5, maybe. I think less than that, probably like 3 or 4 houses that exist with 17th century oil paintings in Jolfa. And on the upper right, you're looking at wall paintings from the Chehel Satoon, which means 40 columns, the palace that was built by Shah Abbas II in the middle of the 17th century, which was mostly used for welcoming foreign embassies, but also for court receptions as well. So textual and visual evidence indicates that representations such as the oil paintings we saw a few slides earlier were displayed in very public and conspicuous places in Safavid palaces and mansions. Cornelius de Bruyn, who we talked about, observed, and I quote, "figures as big as life and dressed in various fashions in the house of the Armenian merchant, Khoja Sarfraz." Adam Olieris, another visitor to Iran, secretary to the mission sent by Frederick III, noted that the mansion of the Grand Vizier was decorated in the following way, and I quote, "The hall itself had on the upper part of it, towards the roof, several portraits of women, clothed in several modes, all done after some European copies. There is no," end quote, "there is no doubt that the function of these prominently displayed paintings was to impart a sense of refinement and surplus capital that both the Muslim political elite and the Armenian mercantile elite were enjoying at this moment of time. A large part of their communication is this presence of foreign items." The travelers remark on all the types of glassware that were available in the Maidan, often citing Venetian glassware, such as the example we have on the right side, as well as enameled ware. Enamels from Europe, particularly from France, were very popular to the Isfahani wealthy consumer. What's interesting too is that at this moment of 17th century Iran, the art of enameling was not frequently practiced by local artisans, whereas a century later, in the late 18th century and 19th century in particular, the art of enameling really blossoms, blooms. And so this engagement with European enamels, I think, set the scene for the flourishing of this art form in Iran in the later decades. Despite Safavid demand, it seems that Iranian Muslim craftsmen did not imitate Western craftsmanship on a grand scale before the third quarter of the 17th century. The French traveler Jean Chardin, who was in Iran during the 1660s and 1670s, claimed, "The Persians choose," and I quote, "rather to buy goods from strangers than to learn the art of making them." In part, it seems that Chardin was right in his assessment. With some exceptions, generally there was not significant interest on behalf of the court to train Iranian artists to produce locally the most sought-after foreign luxury items, including the glass goblets, enameled objects, the clocks, and the scarlet textiles. Instead, they were purchased. The court purchased them through particular, in addition to the Armenians, the court was purchasing them through certain travelers that formed relationships at court, such as Jean-Baptiste Tavernier and Chardin, who I mentioned earlier. Scholars have cited a real peak of interest in buying European wares under Shah Abbas II, who worked with Tavernier and Chardin and basically created designs with them. We know that Shah Abbas II created designs for a dining set to be made in France for himself. So the emphasis really is on the foreignness of the goods. That had the cachet, rather than actually creating them in Iran at this time. Mirrors were very popular to order through these agents, and here we see a French mirror that would have been of interest to the wealthy. The privilege to own European luxury goods set the court, and here represented by an image of Shah Abbas II in the middle of the 17th century. That's a detail from a wall painting in the audience hall of the Chehel Satoon, and the Armenian merchants, here represented by our protagonist, Petros Veligianian from New Jolfa. Ownership of these foreign goods became a sign of class and social differentiation. In other words, possession of such items as European clocks and imported scarlet textiles did not denote the elite's Europeanization, but rather denoted their economic standing within their own society, which enabled them to acquire foreign goods. Ownership demonstrated also exposure to and interaction with the Europeans in the capital itself. It indicated a certain refinement and sophistication that not many sectors of Isfahani society had. There was this moment of time, however, under Shah Suleiman, and we're looking at this wonderful portrait of Shah Suleiman's court that was made in the 1670s, when he took up the initiative, along with his Grand Vizier, to have local goods, have foreign goods produced locally as a means to control costs. And this also parallels with a slight weakening of the Safavid economic structure and not as much specie, not as much coinage available. So soon after Shah Suleiman acceded to the throne, a letter was dispatched to Charles II of England, requesting an excellent goldsmith, a weapon maker, an engineer, and I quote, a superb painter. He also asked Charles II to send the aforementioned masters together with apprentices and quality materials and the associated tools of each of these professions in order that local craftsmen can be trained by them. So I do wonder if this emphasis on the dispatch of apprentices and proper materials and tools supported the Shah's intention to promote the local manufacture of what the elite was buying from foreigners and to have it produced locally. On a different level, I think that consumption and familiarity with European material culture inspired shifts in Safavid fashion, interiors, and technology. One French traveler remarked, and I quote, "It is only since the Persians traded with the Europeans, as well as by means of their Armenian subjects, as an addition to the European companies, that they have worn cloth stockings in Persia." So basically this fad of wearing breeches, which we're very familiar with from English painting, and you see here Charles I in his breeches, this style became popular in Iran, but it also became a way to identify who was a foreigner in paintings of this time. Here is a single-page painting by Reza Abbasi. Initially was Shah Abbas I's court painter, and he's identifying the European not only through having the lapdog, but also wearing the breeches. Even in the most public spaces, Isfahani society learned about the fashions of Europe. These are wall paintings that have been restored on the bazaar gate in the court area of Isfahan. And here you see this emphasis on Europeans and European dress. These are hard to see. What we're looking at here, though, I apologize for the quality of the images, are landscape paintings. They exist in one of the Armenian palaces of New Julfa. And this genre of painting, landscape painting, was not popular in Iran until the Dutch were established in the empire. So the VOC members who were residing, the Dutch East India Company, who were residing in Iran, were bringing landscape paintings to decorate their houses while they resided there. And this trend to decorate one's domestic interior with landscapes shows up in one of the Armenian merchant houses. And what they're doing is they're imitating the houses of the Dutch elite in Holland. It is around this time that these wall paintings date. They're dated by inscription to 1668, when the house was restored. It was just at this time, the 1660s, when the New Julfa community establishes an offshoot in Amsterdam. So ties between Holland and Iran are even further supported, further bolstered by the interaction between the New Julfa communities in Amsterdam and also Isfahan. So here we see even how one decorates their houses became influenced by this interaction. I also wonder, there's many references to the importation of mirrors, and my guess is that this popularity of using mirror work for one's houses and the Safavid palaces probably is influenced by the trade in mirrors. Consumption of European goods served as a catalyst for innovation in Safavid art and architecture, as well as shifts in aesthetic attitudes. Scholars have interpreted consumption of European goods simply as a fascination or identification with the West. By briefly looking at consumption habits of the elite in connection with broader currents of Safavid culture, I believe we should offer a different interpretation. The acquisition of European goods does not denote the Europeanization of Iran's well-to-do, but rather signifies the prosperity of an elite with an ever-increasing international outlook, which affected shifts in attitudes towards innovation and evolving notions of modernity. And I'm going to stop there and go to questions.